Sometimes, the doors we avoid the longest are the ones waiting to give everything back. The night Daniel Hayes was evicted, the air carried a kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin, it settled into the bones, the kind that made even the streetlights look distant and unsure of themselves as they flickered above an empty sidewalk while a single duffel bag rested at his feet, and everything he owned fit inside it with room to spare, and beside him stood Rex. A 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick gray and cream coat that caught the pale light like frost on steel, ears high. Eyes alert, watching not the world behind them but the silence ahead as if he already knew they were heading somewhere that mattered. Daniel didn't say much, he hadn't for a long time, not since the war taught him that silence could be safer than words, but even silence had a weight to it now, heavier than the pack he used to carry across miles of unforgiving terrain, heavier than the memories he never quite managed to leave behind. And as he glanced once more at the apartment door that had closed on him without ceremony, without apology, he felt something inside him shift, not anger, not even sadness, just the quiet realization that there was nowhere left to go except backward. The drive took longer than he remembered, the road stretching out through miles of darkened countryside where the wind brushed against the truck like a whisper trying to be heard, and Rex sat steady in the passenger seat. His posture calm but focused, nose occasionally lifting as if catching scents carried from places Daniel hadn't thought about in years, and when the old house finally came into view, it stood exactly as memory had left it, and yet entirely different. A weathered structure at the edge of town where the trees grew too close and the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, its windows dark, its porch sagging slightly, as though time itself had grown tired of waiting. Daniel killed the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet settle in around him, a kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, layered with echoes of laughter. Footsteps, and a voice he hadn't heard in years, his grandmother's voice, soft but certain, the kind that made even the smallest things feel important, and for a brief second, he wondered if coming back had been a mistake, but Rex had already shifted, paws pressing against the door, eager in a way that wasn't just about movement, it was something deeper, something instinctive, and when Daniel finally stepped out, the gravel crunched beneath his boots with a sound that felt louder than it should. As if the ground itself was acknowledging his return. The front door resisted at first, the wood swollen with age and seasons, but it gave way with a low creak that carried through the house like a breath released after years of holding it in, and inside, the air was cool and still, tinged with the faint scent of dust and old wood, a place untouched not just by people but by time itself, and Daniel moved slowly, each step measured, each glance taking in the familiar shapes of furniture draped in pale sheets, the outlines of a life paused rather than ended, while Rex moved differently, not cautious but purposeful, his nails clicking softly against the floor as he crossed the room, pausing only once to lift his head, ears tilting slightly as if listening to something far beneath the surface of sound. Daniel didn't notice it at first, not the shift, not the subtle change in the way Rex held himself, because his own thoughts were louder, pulling him backward into moments he had spent years trying not to revisit. But then came the sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a low, steady rhythm that didn't belong to the house or the wind or anything he could immediately explain, and Rex froze, his body going still in that precise way Daniel had learned to trust during long nights overseas when stillness meant attention and attention meant something was about to change, and slowly, deliberately. The dog turned his head toward the far end of the hallway where a narrow door stood. Closed, its paint chipped, its handle dulled by time, and Daniel felt it then too, not as a sound but as a presence, something waiting, something patient, something that had not been disturbed in years but had never truly been silent. And as Rex took a single step forward, then another, his tail low but steady, Daniel followed without thinking, drawn by something he couldn't name, something that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, as though whatever lay beyond that door had been expecting them all along. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, each step carrying a faint echo that lingered just a second too long, as if the house itself was listening, remembering, and when Daniel reached the narrow door at the end, he hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the worn brass handle that had not been turned in years, because somewhere deep in his memory there was a voice, gentle but firm, telling him not to go down there. Not yet, and for a moment he almost listened to it again. Almost turned back, but Rex shifted beside him, letting out a low breath that was not quite a growl and not quite a warning, something older than either, something that spoke of instinct and certainty. And the dog placed one paw against the base of the door, pressing lightly as if to say that whatever waited beyond it was not meant to stay hidden any longer. The handle turned with a quiet resistance, metal scraping softly against itself. And when the door opened, a thin breath of colder air drifted upward, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something faintly metallic and distant, like rain on old stone, and the staircase revealed itself slowly in the dim light, wooden steps descending into shadow, each one worn at the center from footsteps long gone, and Daniel felt a subtle tension settle into his chest, not fear exactly, but the awareness of crossing into a space that had not been touched by time in the same way as the rest of the house. Rex did not wait. He moved forward with steady purpose, his nails tapping softly against the first step before disappearing into the dim below, his silhouette fading into the darkness as though he belonged there, as though he had always known this path, and Daniel followed, one hand brushing lightly against the wall for balance, the wood cool beneath his fingertips, grounding him in a moment that felt strangely distant from everything else he had lived through. The air grew heavier with each step, thicker, carrying a stillness that felt almost deliberate, and then he heard it again, that faint rhythm, steady and measured, not loud enough to be obvious but too consistent to ignore, and it did not echo like sound usually did in enclosed spaces. Instead it seemed to settle into the walls themselves, as if the structure of the basement was holding on to it, repeating it quietly over and over again. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a wide, low room lined with old shelves and covered furniture, shapes softened by years of dust and neglect, and a single narrow window near the ceiling let in just enough pale light to reveal the outlines of what remained. But it was not the room itself that held Daniel's attention, it was Rex, standing perfectly still near the far wall, his ears high, his body angled slightly as though listening not to the room but through it, and when Daniel stepped closer, he noticed the subtle difference. The wall in front of the dog was not like the others, the wood there looked older, darker, its surface uneven in a way that suggested it had been altered, touched, perhaps even concealed. Rex moved again, slow and deliberate, his nose brushing along the lower edge of the wall before stopping at a single point where the floorboards met the base, and then he pawed once, gently. Not with urgency but with certainty, and Daniel crouched down, his fingers tracing the same line, feeling the faint gap where two boards did not quite align, and as he pressed against it, the wood shifted just slightly, enough to confirm what instinct had already begun to tell him, that this was not just a wall, not entirely, and the rhythm grew clearer now, not louder, but closer, as if whatever produced it was aware of their presence, responding in some quiet, measured way. He paused, glancing at Rex, whose amber eyes met his with a calm that carried no fear, only expectation, and for a brief moment Daniel felt something he had not felt in a long time, not since before everything had begun to fall apart, a sense of purpose, small but undeniable, and he exhaled slowly, placing his hand firmly against the uneven wood before pushing with steady pressure, and the panel gave way with a soft, reluctant shift, revealing a narrow gap that breathed out a deeper cold, a colder air than anything above, and beyond it, there was darkness, not empty, not silent, but waiting. As though the basement had only been the beginning of something that had been hidden for far longer than he could yet understand. The gap in the wall did not open fully at first, as if whatever lay beyond it resisted being revealed too quickly, and Daniel had to press again, firmer this time, until the wood shifted enough to allow a narrow space just wide enough for a man to pass through, and the moment it did, the air changed, noticeably colder, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by the passing of years, as though time itself had chosen not to enter. Rex stepped through first without hesitation, his body lowering slightly as he moved, not in fear but in focus, the way he had been trained to approach something important, something unknown, and Daniel followed, ducking slightly as he crossed the threshold, his shoulder brushing lightly against the rough edge of the hidden panel before he straightened on the other side, and what he saw there made him stop, not from shock, but from a quiet kind of disbelief that settled slowly into his chest. The space beyond was not like the basement at all, it was smaller. More contained, yet far more deliberate, the walls reinforced with older wood beams that had been carefully placed, the floor swept clean as if someone had maintained it long after the rest of the house had been forgotten, and at the center of the room stood a heavy wooden table, its surface worn but clear, holding only a single object, a small metal box, rectangular, dull in color but solid in presence. The kind of thing that did not belong to chance or clutter but to intention. The faint rhythm Daniel had been hearing seemed to settle here, not louder, not clearer, but somehow closer, as if it had led them exactly to this point, and he took a slow step forward, then another, the sound of his boots softened by the clean floor beneath him, until he stood just a few feet from the table, his eyes fixed on the box, his mind searching for a reason, a memory, anything that might explain why it felt so familiar even though he knew he had never seen it before. Rex circled once around the table, his nose low, his breathing steady, and then he stopped beside it, sitting down with a calm certainty that felt almost human, his gaze lifting toward Daniel as if to say that this was it. That whatever they had come for had always been here, waiting. Daniel reached out slowly, his fingers hovering above the surface of the box before finally making contact, the metal cool to the touch, grounding in a way that brought him fully into the moment, and as he rested his hand there, the faint rhythm he had followed all the way down seemed to fade, not disappear, but quiet, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. He glanced around the room again, taking in the careful details he had missed at first, the way the beams were reinforced, the absence of dust on the table, the subtle marks along the wall that suggested this place had been opened before, not recently, but not as long ago as everything else above, and then he noticed it, a small envelope resting flat beneath the edge of the box, almost hidden, its paper aged but intact, the handwriting on it delicate and steady, and his breath caught slightly as he recognized the style. Not because he had seen these exact words before, but because something in the shape of the letters, the way they curved and held their place, felt undeniably hers. He pulled the envelope free with careful fingers, turning it over slowly, his eyes tracing the ink that had not yet faded despite the years, and though he had not expected it, though nothing about this night had followed anything close to expectation, he felt something shift inside him again, not uncertainty this time, but something steadier. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding, and as Rex remained seated beside the table, quiet and watchful, Daniel opened the envelope, the paper sliding softly against itself, revealing a single folded page inside, and for a moment he did not read it, he simply held it there, feeling the weight of it, the quiet intention behind it, as if whatever words waited on that page had been written not just to be found, but to be found now, in this exact moment, when there was nothing left to lose and everything still waiting to be uncovered. The paper felt lighter than Daniel expected, almost fragile between his fingers, yet it carried a weight that settled deeper than anything he had held in years, and when he finally unfolded it, the faint sound of the crease echoed softly in the quiet room as if even that small movement mattered, as if the act of opening it completed something that had been waiting a very long time. The handwriting stretched across the page in steady lines, each letter deliberate, familiar in a way that reached past memory and into something more instinctive, and he read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because each one seemed to arrive with a presence of its own, as though they were being spoken again in the same calm, certain voice he had known as a child, a voice that never rushed, never demanded, only guided. It spoke of time, of patience, of things hidden not to be lost but to be found when they were needed most. And as Daniel's eyes moved from one line to the next, the room around him seemed to fade slightly, the edges softening, the silence deepening into something that felt almost like listening rather than emptiness. And he realized then that this was not just a message left behind, it was a message meant for this exact moment, written for a version of him that had not yet existed when the ink first touched the page. Rex shifted beside him, his presence steady and grounding. His ears relaxed now but still attentive, as if whatever had drawn him here had resolved into understanding, and Daniel lowered the page for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the small metal box resting at the center of the table, its surface unchanged, quiet, waiting, and for the first time since stepping into the house, he felt something beyond curiosity or caution, something closer to recognition, as though this place, this hidden room, and everything within it had been part of a path he had been walking long before he realized it. He returned to the letter, his focus narrowing again as the final lines revealed more than he expected, not instructions exactly, but an invitation, a quiet assurance that what lay inside the box was not meant to fix what had been lost, but to reveal what had always been there, something he had not yet seen, and as he finished reading, he did not rush, he simply stood there for a moment, holding the paper, letting the meaning settle in the same slow, steady way the rhythm had guided him here. When he placed the letter gently back on the table, his movements felt more certain, less driven by reaction and more by intention, and his hand returned to the box, this time not hovering, not hesitating, but resting firmly on its surface as he traced along its edge, feeling the subtle groove where the lid met the base, the small imperfections that spoke of age and use, and then he noticed it. A narrow seam along one side where the metal was slightly different, a detail so small it could easily be missed, yet once seen, impossible to ignore. Rex leaned forward slightly, his nose close but not touching, his attention fixed in that quiet, focused way that had guided Daniel through countless uncertain moments before, and without speaking, without even needing to think it through, Daniel pressed gently against the seam, and the box responded with a soft click, the sound precise and unmistakable, echoing faintly against the reinforced walls as though marking the beginning of something rather than the end. He lifted the lid slowly, not out of caution, but out of respect for the moment, and inside, the contents were not what he had expected, not piles of documents or something immediately valuable, but something simpler, something more deliberate, arranged carefully as if each item held its own meaning, and though he had not yet fully understood what he was looking at, he felt it again. That same steady shift within him, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but undeniable. The quiet realization that whatever had been hidden here was never meant to be found by just anyone, it had been waiting for him. For this version of him, the one who had nothing left to hold on to except the choice to keep moving forward, and as the stillness of the room settled once more, it no longer felt empty or forgotten, it felt complete, as though something long unfinished had finally been brought into the light. For a long moment, Daniel did not move, his eyes adjusting not just to what lay inside the box, but to what it meant, because the contents were simple in form yet heavy with intention. A small stack of neatly bound journals tied with a faded cloth ribbon, a set of old photographs carefully preserved between sheets of wax paper, and beneath them, a leather pouch that looked worn from years of quiet use. And none of it carried the shine of wealth or the obvious weight of fortune, yet something about the way it had all been arranged made it clear that this was not random, this was chosen. Rex remained beside him, calm but attentive, his presence steady as ever, and when Daniel reached for the journals, his fingers moved with a kind of hesitation that was not fear, but respect, as if he understood that once he began to uncover what was written there, he would not be able to return to the version of himself that had walked into this house hours earlier. The first journal opened with a soft resistance, its spine worn but strong, and the pages within carried the same careful handwriting as the letter, each line steady, each word deliberate, and as Daniel read, the quiet room seemed to deepen around him, the reinforced walls holding not just sound, but memory itself, because the entries were not simple notes or records, they were reflections, observations, pieces of a life lived with attention and intention. And slowly, line by line, a picture began to form, not just of the woman he had known as his grandmother, but of a part of her life she had never spoken of, a part rooted in patience, in quiet work, in something that extended far beyond the walls of the house above. The photographs confirmed it, small glimpses of places Daniel did not recognize at first, landscapes that stretched wide under open skies, buildings that looked older than the town itself, and people whose faces carried stories of their own, all connected by a thread he could not yet fully see, but could feel growing stronger with every page he turned. The rhythm that had guided him down into this space did not return, but its absence felt intentional, as if it had led him here and now stepped aside, leaving him to understand the rest on his own. And when he finally set the journal down, his attention shifted to the leather pouch, its surface marked by years of careful handling, the stitching still intact. The drawstring tied with a simple knot that had not been undone in a very long time. He loosened it slowly, the leather creaking softly as it opened, and inside, he found a small collection of items that seemed almost ordinary at first glance, a few old keys of different shapes and sizes, a folded map worn at the edges, and a small metallic token stamped with a symbol he did not immediately recognize, yet something about it stirred a faint memory, not clear, not complete, but present enough to make him pause. Rex leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the contents before. He sat back again, his posture relaxed now, as if whatever purpose had driven him here had settled into quiet understanding, and Daniel unfolded the map carefully, spreading it across the table, his eyes tracing the lines that stretched across it, the familiar shape of the surrounding region outlined in faded ink, but marked with subtle details he had never seen before, small symbols placed at specific points, lines connecting them in ways that suggested intention rather than coincidence, and at the center of it all, there was a single mark, drawn slightly darker than the rest, positioned exactly where the house stood. He exhaled slowly, the realization not sudden but steady, building piece by piece as everything began to align, the journals, the photographs, the keys, the map, all parts of something larger than a hidden room or a forgotten inheritance, something that had been quietly waiting, not just for discovery, but for understanding. And as he stood there, looking down at the map with Rex beside him, the stillness of the room no longer felt like an end point. It felt like the beginning of a path he had not known he was meant to follow, one that stretched beyond the basement, beyond the house, into something that had been prepared long before he ever lost his way. Daniel remained still for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of the map as if they might shift under his gaze, as if the ink itself held more than simple directions, and the longer he looked, the more the symbols began to feel less like markings and more like memories placed deliberately across distance and time, each one carrying a quiet significance he could not yet fully explain but could no longer ignore. The house beneath his feet was not just a place he had returned to, it was a point of origin, a center drawn carefully in a design that extended far beyond the walls that surrounded him, and as that realization settled in, something inside him began to steady. A feeling he had not known in years, not since before everything had unraveled into uncertainty and silence. Rex shifted beside him, rising slowly from his seated position, his ears lifting again, not with the urgency from before, but with a renewed focus, as if the purpose that had brought them into this hidden space was beginning to unfold into its next step, and Daniel followed his gaze, watching as the dog turned toward the far side of the chamber, where the reinforced beams met the stone foundation, a place that had seemed unremarkable at first glance but now carried a subtle difference, a faint variation in texture that suggested the space had been shaped with more intention than the rest. Daniel stepped closer, his boots moving quietly across the clean floor, and as he reached the wall, he noticed it, a narrow metal bracket set low against the wood, almost flush with the surface, its presence so subtle it would have gone unnoticed without the shift in perspective that now guided his attention, and when he crouched down, his fingers brushing lightly against it, he felt the cool certainty of something designed to be found only by those who knew where to look, or perhaps those who were meant to arrive. The keys from the pouch came back to him then, their weight suddenly more significant, and he reached into the box again, retrieving them with careful precision, each one different in shape and size, each one carrying a quiet purpose that had not been revealed until now, and as he held them in his hand, he felt the same sense of alignment that had followed him since opening the letter, the pieces fitting together not through force, but through understanding. One of the keys, smaller than the others but heavier than it appeared, matched the bracket almost exactly, its edges aligning with a precision that left no room for doubt. And as Daniel inserted it slowly, the metal met with a soft resistance before turning with a muted click, a sound that echoed gently through the chamber as if acknowledging the moment, and for a brief second, nothing happened, the stillness returning as though the space itself was deciding what to reveal next. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wall shifted, not outward, not with any sudden movement, but inward, a narrow section sliding back just enough to reveal a second compartment. Smaller than the room they stood in but deeper, extending into darkness. That seemed less like absence and more like depth, and from within it, there came a faint glow, not bright, not harsh, but steady, a soft light that illuminated just enough to suggest that whatever lay inside was not forgotten, but preserved. Rex stepped forward again, his movements calm and deliberate, his tail low but steady, and Daniel followed, drawn by the quiet pull of something that felt less like curiosity and more like purpose. And as he leaned slightly to look inside, the glow revealed a series of wooden shelves carved directly into the stone, each one holding objects arranged with care, not for display, but for continuity, as if this place had been maintained not by presence, but by intention. There were more journals, older ones with darker covers, small containers sealed with wax, and at the center of it all, resting on a raised platform, there was a simple glass case, clear and untouched, holding within it a folded document that seemed to carry a significance beyond anything else in the room, its edges crisp despite the years, its presence unmistakable, and Daniel felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty, that this was not just a discovery, not just a hidden inheritance or a forgotten secret, but the continuation of something that had been quietly waiting for him to step into it. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooler air of the compartment, and as he reached toward the glass case, he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because for the first time since that night had begun, he realized that what he was uncovering was not meant to restore what he had lost, but to reveal what had always been placed before him, waiting for the moment when he would have nothing left to distract him from seeing it clearly. And as Rex stood beside him, silent and steady, the quiet of the hidden space no longer felt like something separate from the world above, it felt connected, as though the path that had led him here was only the beginning of where he was meant to go next. Daniel did not rush his next movement, his hand hovering just inches from the glass case as the faint glow reflected softly across its surface, and for a moment, the entire space seemed to hold its breath with him, the stillness settling into something deeper than silence, something that felt almost like recognition, as though this moment had existed long before he ever stepped into the house. Rex remained beside him, steady and calm, his presence grounded in a way that made everything else feel clearer, and when Daniel finally lowered his hand, his fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface of the glass, there was no resistance, no lock, only a quiet acceptance as the case shifted open with a soft, almost inaudible release. Inside, the folded document rested exactly where it had been waiting, its edges sharp, its surface untouched by dust or time, and as Daniel lifted it carefully, he felt that same familiar weight again, not heavy in his hands, but significant in a way that reached far beyond the physical, as if what he held was not just paper, but something that carried intention across years. He unfolded it slowly, the sound of the paper moving through the quiet room echoing just enough to remind him that he was still there, still present, and as his eyes moved across the lines, the meaning began to settle in piece by piece, not all at once, but steadily, deliberately, the way everything else had revealed itself that night. It was not a will in the traditional sense, not a simple transfer of ownership or property, but something more layered, more intentional, a record of responsibility, of trust, of something that extended beyond a single generation, and as he read, the pieces that had once felt scattered began to align. The journals, the map, the keys, the hidden spaces, all part of a structure that had been built quietly over time, not to be hidden forever, but to be passed forward when the moment was right. Rex shifted slightly, his head tilting as if listening again, though no sound followed, and Daniel glanced at him briefly before returning his focus to the document, where the final lines carried a clarity that left no room for doubt, not instructions, not demands, but an understanding that what had been preserved here was not meant to be kept locked away, but to be continued, to be lived, to be carried forward by someone who had learned what it meant to lose everything and still choose to move forward. The realization did not come as a shock, it settled into him gradually, filling the space where uncertainty had once lived, replacing it with something steadier, something that felt like direction, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt as though he was not simply reacting to what life had taken from him, but stepping into something that had been waiting for him all along. He lowered the document slightly, his eyes moving across the room again, taking in the shelves, the journals, the quiet order of everything that had been placed here with such care, and he understood then that this was not an end point, not a discovery meant to close a chapter, but the beginning of something far larger than he had imagined when he first stepped through the front door of the house. Rex moved closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, a simple gesture that carried a quiet reassurance, and Daniel reached down briefly, his hand resting against the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fingers, grounding him in the present even as his mind stretched forward into what came next. The faint glow within the compartment seemed to shift slightly, not changing in brightness, but in presence, as if acknowledging the transition from discovery to understanding, and Daniel folded the document carefully, not with hesitation, but with purpose, placing it back into the case for a moment before closing it gently, the soft click marking not an end, but a confirmation. When he straightened, the room felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because he had, the uncertainty that had followed him into the house no longer pressing at the edges of his thoughts, replaced instead by a quiet clarity that did not demand answers, but offered direction, and as he looked once more at the map still spread across the table behind him, the lines no longer felt distant or abstract, they felt reachable, connected. Part of a path that extended outward from this very place. Rex stepped ahead again, not toward the exit this time, but back toward the main chamber, his movement calm and certain, as if guiding not just the way out, but the next step entirely, and Daniel followed, the folded weight of understanding settling into him with each step, knowing now that what he had uncovered was not just something left behind, but something entrusted, something that would only reveal its full meaning if he chose to follow it beyond the walls that had kept it hidden for so long. The air in the basement felt different as Daniel stepped back into the main chamber, not lighter, not warmer, but somehow more open, as if the space itself had shifted from holding something hidden to allowing something to continue, and he paused for a moment near the table where the map still lay spread out, its faded lines no longer distant or uncertain but quietly inviting, and when his eyes followed the markings again, he noticed details he had missed before, small handwritten notes along the edges, barely visible unless the light struck them just right, coordinates, names, dates, all placed with a precision that suggested not randomness but a sequence, a path that had been walked, recorded, and left behind with care. Rex moved slowly around the table, his nose close to the surface but his pace unhurried, as though the urgency that had brought them here had softened into something steadier, something more deliberate, and when he stopped near one corner of the map, his ears lifted slightly, his posture aligning with a quiet focus that Daniel had come to trust, and following his gaze, Daniel leaned closer, noticing a small marking near the edge. A circle drawn lightly around a point several miles beyond the town, a place he vaguely recognized, but had never given much thought to, an old stretch of land near a narrow river bend where the road thinned and the trees grew dense. He exhaled slowly, the realization settling in not as a surprise, but as a continuation, the next step laid out as clearly as everything that had led him here, and when he reached for the map, his hands moved with purpose, folding it carefully along its worn lines before sliding it into the leather pouch alongside the keys, the metal token resting quietly against them as if completing the set. The journals remained on the table, their presence steady and patient, and though he knew they held more answers, more history, he understood that not everything needed to be uncovered at once, that some things revealed themselves only when the time was right, just as this had. Rex turned toward the staircase then, not with urgency, but with a calm certainty, his steps measured as he began to climb. And Daniel followed, each step upward carrying a subtle shift in the air, the deeper stillness of the hidden space giving way to the quieter, more familiar silence of the house above, and when they emerged into the hallway, the dim light filtering through the windows had softened, the first hints of early morning stretching across the floor in pale, quiet lines. Daniel paused there, his hand resting briefly against the wall, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the moment as everything settled into place, and for the first time since he had arrived, the house did not feel empty, it felt present, filled not with noise or movement, but with a kind of quiet continuity, as though the life that had once lived here had not ended, only shifted into something less visible but no less real. He moved toward the front door, stepping out onto the porch as the cool morning air met him with a gentler touch than the night before, the sky just beginning to lighten at the horizon, soft hues of gray and pale gold stretching across the distance, and Rex stepped beside him, his gaze fixed outward, not scanning, not searching, but simply observing. As if he too understood that the direction ahead was no longer uncertain, Daniel looked out across the land, the familiar shapes of the town resting quietly in the distance, and beyond them, somewhere unseen but now clearly marked in his mind, lay the next place on the map, the next point in a path that had been drawn long before he ever knew it existed. And as he stood there, the weight he had carried for so long did not disappear, but it shifted, settling into something more balanced. Something that no longer held him back but moved with him, and he realized then that what had been left for him was not simply a hidden inheritance, or a forgotten secret, it was a direction, a purpose shaped not by what he had lost, but by what he was now ready to follow. Rex let out a soft breath, his tail giving a slow, steady movement, and Daniel glanced down at him briefly before looking forward again, the quiet of the morning stretching out in front of them, open and waiting. And though he did not yet know exactly what he would find at the next mark on the map, he understood something far more important, that he was no longer searching for a place to belong, he had already found the beginning of it, and everything that came next would be built from that foundation, one step at a time, guided not by chance, but by something far more deliberate than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The morning did not rush itself, it unfolded slowly across the horizon, light stretching gently over the trees and rooftops as if the world itself understood that some moments were not meant to be hurried, and Daniel remained standing on the porch for a long while, the leather pouch resting securely in his hand, the quiet weight of it no longer unfamiliar but grounding, a reminder that what he carried was not just objects, but a continuation of something that had been waiting long before he ever returned. Rex sat beside him, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze fixed outward toward the open road that curved beyond the edge of the property, and there was no urgency in him now, no sharp signal or sudden alert, only a calm readiness. As though the purpose that had guided him through the house had settled into something deeper, something that no longer needed to be announced. Daniel stepped off the porch slowly, the wood beneath his boots giving a soft, familiar creak, and as he moved across the yard, he glanced back once at the house, not with regret or hesitation, but with a quiet acknowledgement, because he understood now that this place was not something he had returned to. It was something that had called him back when the time was right, when he was ready to see what had always been there. The truck sat where he had left it, dusted lightly with the moisture of the early morning, its surface reflecting the soft light of the sky, and as he opened the door, the familiar scent of worn leather and cold metal greeted him, grounding him further in the present, and he placed the pouch carefully on the passenger seat before settling behind the wheel, his hands resting there for a moment, not gripping tightly, not tense, but steady. As though the act of holding on to something had finally found its balance again, Rex jumped up beside him with quiet ease, settling into place with a small shift of his weight, his eyes flicking once toward Daniel before returning to the road ahead, and when the engine turned over, the sound was not loud, not disruptive, but steady, a low hum that blended with the quiet of the morning rather than breaking it. The drive out of the yard felt different from the one that had brought him there, the same road, the same bends and stretches of open land. But now each mile carried a sense of direction that had been absent before, not because he knew exactly what waited ahead, but because he no longer needed certainty to move forward. The map remained folded within the pouch, its markings clear in his mind, the next point along the path no longer distant or abstract but tangible, reachable, and as the town passed by in the distance, still quiet in the early light, Daniel did not feel the pull to stop or to explain. There was nothing left behind there that needed to be reclaimed, because what he had been searching for was never in those places. It had been waiting beneath layers of time and silence, patient and steady until he was ready to find it. The road narrowed gradually as he drove, the houses thinning, the trees growing closer together, their branches arching slightly overhead as if forming a quiet passage, and Rex's ears lifted just slightly, not in alarm, but in awareness, the same calm focus returning in a softer form, guiding rather than urging, and Daniel followed the road without hesitation, each turn aligning with the memory of the map. Each mile bringing him closer to the marked point that now felt less like a destination and more like a continuation. When the river finally came into view, its surface catching the morning light in soft, shifting reflections, Daniel slowed the truck, pulling to the side where the narrow dirt path began, the place where the markings had led, and he stepped out, the cool air meeting him once again. But this time it did not feel heavy or uncertain, it felt clear, open, carrying the quiet promise of something yet to be revealed. Rex moved ahead a few steps, then paused, turning back just enough to meet Daniel's eyes, and in that brief moment there was no question, no hesitation, only the shared understanding that whatever came next, they would meet it together, the same way they had met everything else, with patience, with trust, and with the quiet certainty that some paths are not found by chance, they are remembered. Daniel took a breath, steady and unforced, and as he stepped onto the path, the world around him did not change in any dramatic way. The trees still whispered softly in the breeze, the river still moved with its quiet rhythm, but something within him had shifted, something that no longer searched for what had been lost, but recognized what had been given, and as the path stretched forward, winding gently through the trees, it did not feel like the beginning of something unknown, it felt like the continuation of something that had always been there, waiting for him to take the first step.